Welcome to the channel. I'm David Poe. Today we're going to be painting on an 11 by 14 surface. This is a canvas panel that has been pre-stained with some burnt sienna. The colors I'm using today include cadmium yellow light, alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue, burnt umber, and titanium white. All of these are Utrecht colors. The brushes I'm using are actually cheap brushes that I got from one of the local art stores. And I am also using a couple from Robert Simmons that are, they're all flats. Oh, I take that back. A couple of them are flats. I also use one round. So number 2 round in the Robert Simmons, and then for the flats, it's a 4 and a 6. That I'll be using for this particular composition. I also use a palette knife, just a common diamond-shaped palette knife. No medium today. I'm using Mineral Spirits, Gamsol, which is made by Gamblin. You can see that my source photo today is on the iPad. This scene includes trees, water, sky. I'm going to go with 1/3 being the trees and the water elements, and then the rest of it's going to be sky. Here I'm using the number 2 round. This is actually a small brush. Most of your oil brushes are going to be long handle. This brush is for, I think it's a synthetic round. Like I said, a cheap brush I got from, I think, a Michaels store. I think it's Artist Loft or whatever their home brand is I'm using. Mainly because of the distance to the palette. I'm using for the palette today, by the way, this is a Yugo Plein Air Pochade box. This is the largest size that they make. And if you're in the market for one, I would strongly suggest that this is a good Pochade box to start with. I did replace the acrylic palette that came with it because of primarily because the color was white, and acrylic palettes tend to get cuts in them, especially if you like to use a metal palette knife. So I've inserted, they have an option to purchase a glass palette. This is in the gray neutral tone. So this is a very middle of the road color, and this helps you judge your mixtures a little bit better in terms of the tonal value of your colors, which can be very helpful, not just in the studio, but when you're out doing this in the outdoors, in the plein air. And here I'm just sketching in with the burnt umber, the drawing. And you see on the monitor, hopefully this will help you some. Apologize for the lighting ahead of time. I've got a new space that I'm using, and I'm still trying to figure out what bulbs I need in this particular spot, especially if I am painting in the evening. As you can tell, that's what I'm doing now. And for a lot of us amateurs, if you have to work a full-time job, a lot of the times if we want to do a lot of painting, we're going to have to be painting at night. It's one of the reasons why you see me in these videos not outdoors playing in plein air like you see some of the other videos. I wish I could do that more often. And when I get a chance, I certainly do, but it's sort of cumbersome to bring along all the camera equipment as well to try to accomplish that. So for the time being, at least, I like doing these videos in the evenings where I have full control of the sound, the video, the lighting. But like I said, I'm still playing around with the lighting at this point in this particular room. Hopefully this setup allows you to see the color mixtures better with this palette rather than the French easel I was using. So now you can clearly see my mixtures as I'm mixing the paint colors and such. And then also with the iPad there, you can sort of get an idea of the reference. I know some artists drop the picture in, so it's kind of picture within a picture view. However, there are some drawbacks to that as well. Sometimes, depending on where you drop that picture in, it can take away from being able to see some other things that are going on in the videos. So I've so far not done that. It could be some direction I go in the future. The other thing is that honestly, I don't want you focusing so much on what the reference photo looks like. For me, I'm not really trying for realism. I'm trying to get a sense of the place, but I take a lot of artistic liberties in terms of the interpretation of the landscape. And I use such a limited palette, as you can tell. I'm not always trying to mix to the exact color that I see. Here's the first color mixture I'm making is for the greens. Today, I'm showing you a different method that you can use. Some people find this very handy, is to actually mix some of your color pools prior to applying the paint to the painting surface. So now that I've got a rough sketch which provides me with a little map of what I'm going to be doing, you notice I'm looking at the tonal values of these greens that I'm producing. And of course, because I'm using a limited palette, it makes some of the choices almost automatic. There's only two colors that I can use from the primaries that are going to make green, which is the cad yellow light and the ultramarine blue. And so it's just a matter of figuring out the amount of ultramarine blue in comparison to the cad yellow, and then to tone down that value so that it's not as bright as it possibly can be. In nature, you usually don't see colors that bright and saturated. You will tone it down by using your third color, the third primary, which is always going to dull down your colors. And in this case, that's going to be the alizarin crimson. One thing I've discovered recently is that the permanent alizarin crimson just does not work as the same kind of color as the alizarin crimson, even though alizarin crimson is what we call a fugitive color, meaning that it's not as light fast, that sometimes the color will dissipate over time when it is exposed to extreme sunlight or other environmental conditions. However, in researching some of this, I've discovered that many artists still use the original fugitive alizarin crimson. What they do to compensate for it is to make sure that it is contained within a mixture. And apparently when in a mixture with other colors that are much more light fast, there's less likelihood of the alizarin crimson fading with time. Here, making the other complementary color, which is orange. So we got green, orange, and also you also see there's the dark pool of color is basically a variation of purple. So we got the primaries, and now we got the secondary colors, they're complementary colors. And there I'm just making an orange, and then making some variations of that orange on the palette. Here I'm making a brown because there's going to be some brown shoreline along this waterway. And so the burnt umber is the natural, think of that as kind of your dark orange, if you will. Brown is related with orange most closely. And of course, if I only had the three primaries, you could get a brown by mixing all three of those colors together and adding a little bit of titanium white. But I'm in agreement with some of the artists that suggest that burnt umber just is a nice color to have when you're dealing with a minimum palette, because you can do so many things with it, and honestly, you produce a different type of brown than what can be achieved with the primaries. So I'm just looking at those values, comparing it to the gray palette, which helps me to kind of judge the strength of the tones. And then I'm going to reach for the largest brush I have here. This is still one of those small brushes, but I think it's a number 6 in this Artist Loft series. I believe it's a synthetic blended brush. It's a flat brush, by the way. And so here I'm just going to begin to do the block in. This might be a good point in the video to mention that if you enjoy the content of my videos, there are a number on the channel now, please subscribe. That would help out immensely. And give it a thumbs up if you like the content. If you have any questions or suggestions, you can certainly make those in the comments below. And I try to answer any questions or comments within the first 24 hours of you posting it. So here I'm working on the darks, and for the dark mixture today, I'm going with, there's two choices, by the way, for darks with this very limited palette. I could use ultramarine blue and burnt umber, or I can use ultramarine blue and alizarin crimson, creating a very dark purple, which almost reads as black. And so that's the mixture I'm going with today. Because I've got so much green, I want some of the red underneath that. It will really produce a nice effect, because whenever you paint with green, it craves the complementary color, which is red. So here I'm adding those darks. Just trying to vary the brush strokes. And of course, the nice thing about oils is they're very forgiving. So those shapes I put on will most likely not remain just as they are right at this juncture. It's kind of a pulling and a pushing of the colors on the canvas itself as you go through your painting process. So I don't feel locked in at this point. This is just a block in, which means that I'm using a fair amount of the mineral spirits to make sure that these mixtures are going on in very thin layers at this point. That way, I will be able to come over top of it as needed with stronger color and thicker paint. Since I'm painting alla prima, which means all at once, most of my paintings are completed within just a few hours, I don't necessarily have to worry too much about the fat over lean rule. You've probably heard of that. If you're going to be painting over several days, then you need to keep that in mind, that if you're using mediums, that you would have to add some mediums in to subsequent layers, and make sure that your under layers are not so saturated with oil. Otherwise, that's when you come and make a lot of problems. Is that if you put down too much oil in your mixtures first, what happens is that the paint begins to slide on you, making it very difficult to come in over top of the first initial paint layer if it's got a bunch of oil in it to be able to have that color stick to the other colors that you have down. So that's why you begin thin, and then you add thicker layers of paint over top of it. One thing I will suggest, this is new, of course every artist begins by experimenting, is that I think mediums are really overrated. And maybe this will help identify that. Because today I'm just painting with the paint right out of the tube. And when I need to make the paint a little bit looser so I can kind of brush it, I'm just using a little bit of the Gamsol mineral spirits. And notice too, I'm only really using a couple of brushes today. And that's okay, because all of these are primary colors I'm using. So in essence, there's a little bit of each of the color piles in each mixture that I'm making, which helps to produce a natural sort of harmonization of the colors, or color harmony as we call it. So now that I've got some of the darkest darks sort of sketched in there, I'm now applying the next darkest color, which is a green, which is the darkest green I've got so far that I mixed on the palette. which is the combination of ultramarine blue predominantly with a smaller amount of the cad yellow. And then notice as I'm putting it next to the darkest dark, the red is really standing out in that mixture. The darkest dark, of course, was made with ultramarine blue and the alizarin crimson, but you can tell that the darkest dark leans toward the red family at this point. But once again, because I'm painting in such light layers, that will be somewhat dry by the time I get around to the second pass, if you will, of introducing more color and detail. And when I say detail, I'm not really talking about a lot of, small brushes and really minutia type brush strokes, etc. I'm talking simply about adding a few little colors and highlights that give the illusion of a lot more detail than is actually on or in the painting. Just varying the brush strokes from the pile of paint. And as you see me work, another helpful thing to keep in mind is that you don't have to constantly be cleaning off your palette to get a clean color. Work within the same pool of color. Like I mentioned, I mix the complementary colors, the green, the orange, and the purple. You see clearly dominated on my gray palette. And I will mix those colors within those same pools as we go through the painting. This helps me look at the value and the shifts and changes in that color. Without having something to compare, it becomes very difficult to judge that. And so by just kind of mixing the colors in the same pool areas without needing to scrape it off constantly can save you time and actually help you judge your color values. When I was a younger painter, this stage would drive me crazy. I would look at the painting at this point and start feeling myself judged. Oh, this looks terrible. This doesn't look anything like a group of trees. This is never going to work. It certainly doesn't look like anything I've seen in a museum or even on eBay trying to sell paintings. Maybe you struggle with that too. One way that you can work yourself out is to remember you don't know what the finished painting is going to look like yet. And we know that finished paintings in the museums all have lots and lots of color, lots and lots of strokes, and a building up of the painting has taken place. The artist has started with various colors and then added thicker paint as they've moved along in most cases. So don't be as critical at this junction. You don't have to look at the reference photo, for example, and worry so much about how it does or does not look in comparison to the main thing, because all of that's going to be judged later on. We can't really make those value judgments and comparisons until the whole canvas has been covered with that initial block in. So when we add the sky, when we add the water, only then are we going to know how close we are to matching some of what we saw in the original scene. And of course, this is a photo, and so a photo does not adequately convey all the color shifts. So I'm trying to remember what it was like to be on location. Sometimes I'll make little notes or write little notes on my phone, so that way I can pull up this image and also look at some of the comments that I made. Things like, remember that the darkest areas are kind of bleached out. You can't see what some of those shapes are in the shadow areas. Some of the highlights are blown out a little bit too much. Little helpful notes to remind me to not get into the pattern of trying to exactly mimic the photograph, because the ultimate goal really is for me to give you the experience that I had when I was live on location, not just a representation of the photo, but rather trying to convey the experience of actually being outdoors and looking at this particular scene. Of course, there's no substitute for painting outdoors. But sometimes we do need reference materials. And especially when we don't have enough time to take advantage of the light. Here, adding the lighter tone of green that you see on the palette. So I've mixed those two greens to see that relationship. I've added a little bit of titanium white to knock some of these greens back to give you the perspective of distance. Of course, part of the tricky part of this painting is trying to come up with different shades of green with such a minimalist palette. I've only got a couple of colors I can use to create the greens. The nice thing about this approach, though, is it forces me to really pay attention to the tonal values. The tonal values carry paintings when you use limited palettes, because you're simply not being able to use as many colors. However, there's sort of an unlimited number of colors that can be created from just a very simple palette, and really helps you to grow and learn how to mix your colors. Reduces a bunch of weight if you're going to be going outdoors a lot to paint as well. Carrying around 3 or 4 or 5 tubes of paint is much different than 13 or 14 or 20. And as I mentioned to you before, a limited palette produces color harmony, because in every mixture that you're making, there's usually a little bit of each of the primary colors. And that helps tie a painting together. It makes the colors look like they belong together. As opposed to an expansive palette, where you may put a couple of details in that only use color kind of out of a tube, and it begins to clash with all the other colors that you've used, because if it's not involved in the other mixtures. Sometimes those colors will look foreign. They will look like they don't really belong to the same painting. So you need to be careful about that. Here, I'm working on the water, and notice that, once again, if I was super critical of myself at this point, I might just throw the whole canvas in the trash, because to me, it doesn't look right at this stage. Those colors don't look right. But I'm going to fight the urge to just start all over or beat myself up and continue to work on it. For water, usually I use vertical strokes. In other words, from top to bottom. Today, I'm trying a different method, and that all my strokes for the water are going to go horizontally to see what effect I can get from that, at least initially. And then after I've applied it like that, then I will use a dry brush method to get some vertical strokes for the water. There's quite a bit of different reflections in the water. You see various blues being intermixed with the greens in the water reflections. And so I'm concentrating on getting the kind of middle color, if you will, or base color in there. And then I can always do my modifications later. So at least that's the plan. And it's already becoming clear to me that the darkest darks are probably not dark enough. And that I will want to go back and do something to some of those. While green and red naturally go together, it's a little too red as I look at the painting now. But once again, it's going to change once I get all the other colors next to it. So once I introduce the sky blue, it'll become more evident where the corrections need to take place. Once I have all these major shapes painted in with the first coat. And you'll notice there that my color palette's pretty thin layers of paint at this point. And in some places, the underpainting, which is the stain of the burnt sienna, is actually showing through a little bit. And that orange, I'm hoping, provides a little something extra underneath all the blues that are part of this painting. Because once again, that's the complementary color to blue is orange. Which means that some of the colors then look more saturated, brighter, more intense, simply because of the relationship to the other colors that are on the painting. And hopefully you can see with the iPad, you can see a little bit of the picture there of the reference photo. I'm hoping that you can tell that I am looking at it and I am trying to come up with a color scheme that represents what I experienced. So it's not from my imagination, it's not just randomness. Now, I will make a few adjustments to the landscape as I saw it. I'm not attempting to be terribly accurate with everything that I see there. After all, my purpose is to paint a painting, not to produce a photograph. We have all kinds of equipment that can give us photographs that do a much better job than painters do today. So instead of realism, we are free to use a bit of our imagination, and hopefully our interpretation will ring true and hopefully be more exciting and inspirational than the photos. Otherwise, why paint? Here, I'm just trying to suggest some of the little shade tone differences that we're seeing in the water reflections as we move closer to the viewer. In some of the other areas that you see as the darks at this point will only really make sense when we start adding some highlights, because the highlights are going to be the lighter colors, right? And so they're going to stand out more readily if we have darks for them to be in comparison with, in relationship with. It makes them stand out more. Just like if you have a black background and you put something white on top of it, the white looks more intense because of its relationship to black. Whereas if we change the black background to, say, a camel color, a camel tan, and then we put a white dot on it, the white is not going to look as intense because in relationship to the tan is a pretty light color in and of itself. So remember, the principles about painting, in that painting is all about providing some contrast. In some paintings, you're going to have a lot more darks and less lights, and the reverse is also the same. That sometimes when the painting is predominantly lights, then you're going to have just a few darks, and that's going to register if your brain in some different ways in terms of what gets communicated to you in terms of the focal points, places that you're naturally going to be drawn to look at. You do not want paintings that have about 50% light colors and 50% dark colors. You really want something that accentuates either the darks or the lights. Here I would say that in the reference photo that about maybe 25% dark and 75% light. Or maybe a 30-70 split. Here I'm using that burnt umber that has been mixed with some titanium white to begin looking at some of the beach or riverbank area that we see in this photo. And here once again, notice that oils are so forgiving. So I can go in with some of these strokes and then I can modify later on. And if I didn't get the color exactly right, I can always paint over top of that. Here I see some places along the shoreline, and so I'm putting those in at this point. Some of this I will obliterate later on. And while I have this color on my paintbrush, I'm going to put it in a few areas where I see it. It's always good to use a color around the painting. You can get yourself into trouble if you make a mixture of paint and you only put it one place. It begins to stick out a little bit too much. Now, there may be times in which you want to do that. If you want to draw your attention to a particular focal point, you might use color in that fashion, but normally it can be a distraction rather than a unifying ingredient in the painting. If I was to come along and put just a dot of hot pink, for example, somewhere in this painting, well, it's going to look rather odd and out of place, and it's going to probably draw your attention right to it. But if I take that same hot red, pink, or whatever, and place it in a few different locations, maybe modifying it just slightly, then you may not be drawn to it as a focal point, and it may indeed work towards color harmony with the other colors on the palette. Think, for example, here, this is the sky. It's lighter towards the horizon line, so that's what I'm going with now. This is predominantly more titanium white than the ultramarine blue, but I will change that up as we move to the top of the canvas. Just like the normal sky, it picks up more color, more blue in this case, as we get closer to the top edge of the painting. So right now it sticks out. But once we have that whole large shape painted, it's not going to have the same effect. And at a certain point up, I notice that it's getting darker, and so I'll mix in, as I'm doing here, a little bit more ultramarine blue. I'll leave some space between the two colors in the sky so that I can later go and do a dry brush technique by basically pulling the two colors together, what we might call blending, so that you don't get a flag effect, like a line separating the two colors, but rather a soft increase in the color. Because we will essentially mix those two colors in together, creating a blended color as a transitional color. Here, notice I'm painting up to the green trees, but I'm leaving a little bit of space in between it. Because what I will do later on is use a dry brush to work on some of those edges. I don't want a lot of hard edges in the painting. Soft edges is what we aspire for, or at least I do in this particular painting. Here again, adding a little bit more of the ultramarine blue as we make our way up the painting. Now, I suppose you could argue with me that the blue that I'm putting at the top of this painting looks almost as saturated as the greens. Normally, the sky plane is going to be the lightest color. The next lightest is going to be your land area or water area. And then, of course, the darkest of darks are going to be anything that's vertical. But sometimes you can actually get away with breaking the rules. Maybe today's one of those days with the sky color. I'm going to leave just a few open spots for that orange to show through. And I'm thinking about putting some titanium white mixed with just a tiny bit of cadmium yellow light to produce clouds. There are no clouds on the reference photo, but I find that paintings that just have a plain blue sky are really predictable and kind of boring. I think we much prefer to view paintings that have some dramatics in the sky, even if it's just a few clouds passing by on a nice hot Sunday afternoon. Here again, you can see I'm just painting up to the trees, but I don't want to get a bunch of that green in my brush, at least until I get the sky all in. Some have mentioned, how come you film every stroke that you're making on the palette? Well, I think that maybe this is something that sets me apart. I watch other YouTubers that are artist painters, and I find that I've always had a little bit of frustration when it's a time lapse and there's so much change going on from one shot, a few seconds or a minute or so, and then another shot of the canvas, and it's almost completely different, and it leaves me with more questions than helping in terms of my own painting. And so that's why in these particular videos I've created thus far, almost in all cases I've given you every stroke from the start of the painting to the end, so that way you can sort of learn along with me. And of course, I don't particularly think of myself as an expert painter. I'm simply someone like you, but most likely a hobbyist. And sometimes it's easier to learn from a hobbyist than it is a professional artist, because I'm experiencing the painting process much like you are. Sharing with you some of my frustrations, some of my successes, some things I've learned from other professional artists that I have watched or seen. Well, I guess watch and seen is the same thing. Very well. You know what I mean. Workshops you may attend, etc. Trying to pick up different tasks. And one thing's become very obvious to me is that many professional artists are wonderful painters, but they really struggle to try to convey to us how they achieve the results that they're getting. Here, notice what I'm doing is I'm kind of pushing, what I would describe as pushing and pulling the paint around the edges so that the hard lines are disappearing. And there's a subtle little blend of color created by those brush strokes. And that will continue to get modified throughout the later stages of the painting. Because I don't want you drawn to the top of the trees. That's not the focal point in this painting. I want to give you a sense that these are living trees with their own ebb and flow. Another quick reminder, as you see me working here on a few little details and cleaning the brush and taking an inventory of, I finally covered the painting canvas with paint, so now I can begin to modify it. If you like the content, please subscribe to the channel if you wouldn't mind, and then you'll be notified whenever I release a new video. Give it a thumbs up if you care to as well. Let me know that you like or appreciate something that I've done in these videos. And if you have suggestions or other comments, you can certainly drop them in. I usually respond within 24 hours. Now, if you've just come to complain, to pass judgment on my paintings or my process, there are other places you can do that. So don't expect to see your comments listed if you're going to be a troll and just be disagreeable with everyone. But if you're sincere and you've got some comments to make, even if they're, I think all of us know how to give good criticism and not just complain or belittle other people. So if you're that kind of a person that can give good criticism without overly complaining and beating people up, then by all means I'll certainly allow you to make those kind of comments. But I don't think anybody wants to see a stream of negativity. Here, I believe I'm mixing up the cloud color, which is some titanium white with just a little bit of the cad yellow light. And notice how I do that. I just kind of tap the color until it comes off of the brush. And I'm not really trying to control how that shape looks. In fact, the more random, perhaps the better. And after I just touch the canvas in a few places with these lighter colors, I'm going to clean the brush off here, get it as dry as possible, and then I'm going to go in and further blend that color into the sky. Just primarily on the edges to give it a light, fluffy type feel for at least this particular painting. If you want stormier skies, then maybe you leave a little bit more of your hard edges in, and you don't work as well on perhaps blending. You may want to use some stronger strokes. And sometimes I certainly do. But I find that lately, what I like to do is take this dry brush, and as you see, just kind of pull away a little bit of the color. Maybe take it in a certain direction, as if the wind is blowing it, that kind of thing. The important part here is I try not to obliterate that color that's on top now, or obliterate the color that's underneath it. Because once you do that, it becomes a little harder to suggest clouds, because if the sky gets too light, then that mixture of titanium white with a little bit of cadmium yellow light is not going to stand out as much. Does that make sense to everyone? Here again, I'm trying to take some time to evaluate what I've done so far and what the painting still needs to have happen. Obviously, that big, large blob on the right of the painting needs to be addressed at some point to turn that into basically leaf coverage that's much closer to the viewer. Even though we can't see the tree trunk, we're seeing these overlapping leaves and such. But here, now I'm going to go back into my dark. So obviously I want to leave a little bit of that red, but I'm predominantly going to cover it up because we don't see all of those reds in this scene. But I don't want to obliterate it all. I want a little bit of that shimmering red underneath this dark green. Provides it a certain sort of maturity, if you will. Maturity of color than just a big blotch of dark value there. And then I will intentionally leave a few spots that are already a little lighter. No need to repaint that if I already have it there. And as I'm painting this, I'm thinking, okay, what does foliage look like? Especially when the wind's blowing on it. Giving myself a little bit of permission as I'm holding that brush near the end. You'll notice I've switched to a long handle brush for this. So that way I can build in a little bit more of chaos, if you will. I'm not as in control of the shape. I'm allowing the brush to take on that role. I am also being conscious of letting some of that red remain so that I don't cover it all up. Just most of it. And hoping to look at that reference photo and mimic it to a large extent. I want those shapes in the reference photo to look rather similar, at least, to what I'm painting today. And notice, at this point, we've been painting for an hour. I have not felt the need to have to go and clean the palette off, even though I've got a very small palette with this Bashad box. I'm saving time by just doing the mixtures inside of the pool of color that makes most sense for this painting. Whether that be the blue pool you see there, or the purple, the brown, the orange, the green. Because those are the primary colors I'm basically using throughout this painting. There's a little area of interest down here. This is closer to the viewer, where some grasses are growing on a little bit of a riverbank area. And so I'm trying to build that area up as the painting progresses. And notice, this is really the first time as I'm looking at this where I can see my vision coming to fruition. Before, I would have thrown this painting away in the trash. But I rather like the beach line or river line there on the left. And those cropping of trees there, I think, is beginning to look more realistic to me. Now, I've certainly got a long ways to go. I still don't like the big reddish green blob there on the right of the painting. And I'm not quite sure yet what I'm doing with that. But I see the potential of this becoming hopefully a decent painting. And even if it doesn't, you learn with every painting that you produce. Every painting is not going to be a success. Here I'm trying to mimic some of the reflections I see in the water, especially along this little sand barge that's sitting out there in this lake or river area. Here we go. And pulling it down. Same over here on this opposite shoreline. Just a hint of that over in that area where it's obviously a little bit darker. Not as much sun is reflecting here. Along the way, we make some artist decisions. For example, you can tell in the reference photo, near the bottom of the picture, a lot more blue being reflected in that water. I decided not to put that in. Why? I felt like it would draw the viewer to the bottom of the painting and just kind of leave them there, instead of actually leading them through the painting to experience the foliage and the sky and the other areas. I would describe the pattern as kind of an S shape. You're coming in from the left, and then your eye is going to be taken into a little cove that's also sort of towards the left, and then kind of meandering up the tree line to the sky and back over to this larger tree now that I'm painting as a kind of a buffer to keep you from going off of the end to somebody else's painting to look at. And here I've made a decision that I'm going to use a darker green and basically cover a lot of the red. There's still some little bits of red that are going to shine through, and I want that to happen. But obviously, that was very distracting and needed to be covered. Once again, I'm just kind of touching the canvas. Not a lot of brush strokes here. And I'm keeping the paint layer pretty thin, even as I go through this second pass with more detail work. Incidentally, one of the reasons I bought some of the short handle brushes that I'm not using right now in this particular painting is that they fit so nicely in there's a little storage compartment there at the very top of the pochade box that you can see. And those little brushes will fit right in there with the palette knife. And so if I really wanted to lighten the load, I could essentially put my colors on the palette, stick those 3 brushes plus my palette knife in that little cubby hole there, fold it up, bring along a panel, and I could paint in the public park with with this pochade box on my lap or on a picnic bench or something of this nature without a whole lot of fuss. I did get the Yugo tripod that went with this pochade box. I don't know that it's worth the money that I paid for it. I would suggest that you could find another tripod that would work just as effectively at a lower price point. The side trays, there are side trays that are sold with this model that affix to it with magnets. You can go on YouTube and you'll find some folks have reviewed the pochade box, the Yugo plein air pochade box. And my experience has been that the side trays are really not worth the money. I think they're about $37 a piece. And it's an awkward arrangement. There's only one magnet that actually is holding it to the pochade box top. You see that little indentation on the sides. There are some magnets on a metal piece that clips onto the wood tray and the bottom of the pochade box, but it's not as stable as I would have hoped for. And then in order for the brushes, there's little cuts in the trays for you to kind of sit the brushes in, but they don't appear to be made very well because the brushes don't want to stay in the little grooves. And so you end up having to keep it on the tray, especially if you're going to have it at some kind of an angle, not 90 degrees, but some other kind of an angle. And the brushes can potentially just fall all over the place or fall off, or a slight bump will sometimes take one of those trays off entirely. And so I just discovered that oftentimes that happened to me painting. I would end up hitting that thing and it would really end up being a frustrating experience. So you may just want to, or at least I would recommend, try the pochade box without the side panels. You can always order them later if you think they would be really useful for you. You may want to cut a couple of your long handle brushes or get a set of smaller ones to stick in that cubby hole. And they will rest in there without moving around. Or just hold on to a couple of your brushes as you're painting. Or get one of those other paintbrush wallets, hang it from whatever tripod you have, and then deal with your brushes in that fashion where they're attached to that wallet, and then you can just pull a brush or two out at a time when you need it, rather than to try to make the tray function in that way. There's also no real great solution for using medium with this particular pochade box. The magnets kind of hold a container or a cup for that, but it's not the greatest strength. In other words, you could knock them off pretty quickly. It's another reason why with this pochade box, I've just eliminated that possibility by not using medium and simply using color right out of the tubes. Mixing those colors, and then adding just a little bit of Gamsol when needed. There's a big rubber band that will go around the front of this pochade box where you can use one of those carabiners and suspend the Terps cup from the rubber band. You could also use a carabiner and see about attaching it someplace else on the tripod itself, perhaps. Either one works fairly well. Here I'm taking a mixture now of cad yellow light, and then I mix that with some ultramarine blue not ultramarine blue, but alizarin crimson to produce this orangey kind of yellow ochreish or gold ochre color. And I'm putting that on the tops of the trees. So once again, this pull, this tug of colors around the edges. So I don't want lines up there. I want a kind of feathery approach to where those tree branches intersect with the sky. And I want to also indicate that there is light bouncing up there off of these things, these structures. Now, this color is much darker than what you see in the photo. And the one thing that you will learn when you're using reference photos is that reference photos oftentimes do not do a great job of conveying color relationships. Trust yourself and your memory more so than the photograph. Sorry I have to lean like this to get some of these effects on that larger tree shape. Hopefully I lean back enough at various times to allow you to see me working on some of these edges here. At this point, I'm getting more and more pleased with the painting because I think it's really starting to come together now. So notice how there were various times, almost, you might say, almost the entire video of me painting a painting that looks rather ugly. And I just mentioned that hopefully as encouragement for you to stay with the painting. Don't give up too soon. The real painting really only emerges after you've made a bunch of screw-ups and you've repainted over top of it with other colors. And it's in those relationships of little touches of color here and there that shine through, that actually make for a much more pleasing painting. These tree groupings would be rather boring if they were only composed of one green, for example. But as you know by watching the video, there's alizarin crimson in those trees. There's a sort of a yellow ochre, if you will, from the yellow and the red mixtures, and the blue and the red mixtures. And so there's variety of color in these trees, and in the water, and on the beach line or the river line. All of that contributes to the variety. And notice about highlights, it's not that you have to mix in tons and tons of titanium white to produce a highlight. This mixture of green that I'm sharing is I don't know that it even has any titanium white in it. But it's certainly a lot lighter value than the dark that was originally put down. So that just magnifies the highlight as I put this color on there sparingly to indicate places where the branches are picking up more light than others. And it's predominantly the contrast that's been created between my darkest darks and my lightest lights. I've also noticed that over the time I've been painting, I used to just add way too much titanium white. So one recommendation I would tell you is that keep that in mind. Save your titanium white more towards the end of the painting. That will avoid the chalky type paintings that a lot of beginners produce, when too much titanium white is added too quickly, too soon, to lighten values. Notice how those particular highlights now really pop off the painting. I think those worked well. Now, are they exactly the same as what we see in the photograph? No, and I really didn't want them to be. I think that the painting with some of those contrasts is a little bit more interesting than the reference photo at this point now. And at this point, I'm getting closer and closer to the end of the painting. And now I have to be careful that I don't ruin it. I'm trying to be selective. What details remain? What is not clear to the viewer? This area here is probably not very clear to the viewer. And so now I'm focusing some attention here so that people, as they just see the image for the first time, will recognize that this is obviously part of the river bank, and that there's some foliage that's growing a little bit into the water, going up the shoreline. This is obviously closer to the viewer, and so I want some of those highlights there. Over here is a little bit of a sand barge going out into the water, which I find is an effective compositional piece, moving and directing your eye back to that focal point, if you will, where you see the sky meet the water, right there at the edge. When all of those kind of color groups are coming together, the lights, the darks. I think that empty space kind of suggesting that the water is going someplace else. It's not stopping. It's not necessarily a lake, or if it is a lake, we can't tell where that water stops. So it creates a little bit of interest. Your mind has to make a few decisions. And the overall effect is I want you to get the sense of a pleasant afternoon. It's sunny, maybe not terribly hot yet. There's cool water here. It's not turbulent, it's very calm water. So hopefully giving you a sense of peace. I'm painting, this is after Easter, so Easter afternoon, or evening rather. And so it was a calm day, and even though the reference photo is from earlier, I'm thinking about that emotion as being what I want to communicate to the viewer. Just a sense of calm peace. That this would be a nice place to just sit down, to relax, and just watch. Experience the wind hitting your skin, looking at the trees, the branches, the new foliage that's emerging, the leaves that are coming out, watching the calm water. Here, I'm using the palette knife to get a few chaotic marks and thinner lines indicating some of the banks of the river here. I'm going to do that, I just did it on that one side, I think effectively pushing that back a little bit further in the distance. And now here, I'm going to have a little bit more of a sharp edge, and a few lighter tones to convey that sense on the other side of the river. That there are places where the water is clearly not visible. There's sunlight bouncing up off the ground layer, up towards the heavens. Keeping that one little cove area very dark is a kind of a point of interest, if not the focal point. And then right along this little bank here, there's some places where you can kind of see some water, and yet at the same time, the bank. And so concentrated on putting a little line, and then also a little bit of a reflective movement as I pull those colors down into the water, as if those colors, of course, are being reflected into the rather shallow end of this water feature. Here, since I added some lights, I'm also going to add a little bit of darks. And this particular dark, I'm using a different combination to create it. I'm using ultramarine blue and then the burnt umber to get a little bit of contrast there. Usually around the riverbank, you will see some really light areas and then also some very dark areas, depending on how the rocks are either allowing light to reflect or hit some areas or taking it away. And I think you'll notice as I put that one mark, especially in that little cove area, more towards the center of the painting or the left side, that really helped push it back and also create a little bit more interest. Hopefully your eye kind of wants to go back there and say, what's going on back there? Well, pretty soon I'm just going to sign this painting, and I think that this is almost done. So thank you so much for joining me, and have a great day.